Hello and welcome to Stories from the Wire, the AppNeta podcast, where we talk to the experts about the most pressing app and network issues facing the enterprise today and tell you how to work smarter, not harder, to speed up resolution. I'm Paul Davenport, AppNeta's resident tech journalist, and each week we're going to dive into a specific issue that we've helped an IT team tackle. Today, and over the coming weeks, we're looking at work from home, perhaps the hot topic of the past year, how enterprises are optimizing their infrastructure to support a work from anywhere future. So it's been a long and trying school year for parents and students alike, who are all hopefully in the midst of enjoying a much more conventional summer vacation this year than last. But even with many students returning fully to the classroom this fall, how much of the digital transformation that took place in education and really at home during the pandemic will hold over? Well, according to new survey data by Deloitte, quite a bit. Spending on new tech is forecast to jump 37% for K-12 students and 16% for college students over 2020 levels, with parents and students seeking out an estimated $11.8 billion in new computers, smartphones, tablets, and wearables. And with remote work and schooling potentially still on the table for fall 2021, users that had been jockeying for their share of internet capacity at home throughout the pandemic will likely have even more devices crowding their residential Wi-Fi after Labor Day. So, to help us unpack it all, I've invited AppNeta's Chief Customer Officer, Adam Edwards, to join Alec and I to discuss how IT teams can better support remote staff who may be working from a crowded residential connection later in the fall. Adam, welcome to the show.
Morning, Paul. Great to be with you today.
Awesome. And Alec, how's it going up there?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me.
All right. So to kick things off, I'm going to lead with some banner figures from that Deloitte survey. So in total, Deloitte expects that Americans will spend $32.5 billion on K-12 students, or $612 per student, while back to college tech spending will top $26 billion, roughly $1,500 per student. This represents a 16% and 5% increase, respectively, over 2020. Now, getting even more specific, 58% of those polled said that they plan to purchase online resources leading into the new school year, which will result in one of the biggest back-to-school spending sprees in recent memory. So, looking at all these figures, I guess, what's your initial reaction, aside from hide your wallet?
Well, as a parent of two teenage boys, I think I have some good firsthand experience here. I'm not really surprised to hear that the spending is up noticeably over last year. I mean, when you think about the IT resources and the physical devices that were needed when kids were remote schooling from home, you don't need the state-of-the-art smartphone if you're sitting at the kitchen table for 6 hours a day. But when kids are getting back on the bus in scale and they're spending time away after school activities, the need to keep in touch, the need to streamline logistics and activities, that means all the newer devices. And frankly, there was probably some IT device aging that permeated through home during work from home that we're now doing those refreshes. So enterprises update their technology typically on anywhere from 2 to 5 year refresh cycles. Consumer devices, how often or how long do you keep your phone? So I think we're seeing a lot of that refresh, and that's probably easily driving a 5 to 15% bump. And just an additional thought, if you look at the news in the last year, in addition to the global pandemic, security is front and center and near and dear to all of our hearts. Security as students exercise SaaS applications that run academics and school, security for work from home users who are now operating in kind of a much larger and dirtier sandbox where their home network is conflated with the IT network. And you hear about SolarWinds and Kaseya and ransomware and all these hacks. So I think you could easily see an uptick in spending even across consumers and just doing things like endpoint security and Norton LifeLock or other products like that to better protect endpoints when you're working from home.
So you think that it's not just on enterprise IT, even from the consumer side, they're going to be spending on, if not hardware, software that might not have been a conventional spend when they thought about back to school or even logging on from home. So could you unpack maybe a little bit more about those security concerns, or even just, I really like the dirtier sandbox that we're playing and reference that you made, and just why that might be the case?
I think from an endpoint standpoint, it's always been a best practice to have your Windows firewall turned on, and the perception has been that Macs are secure. But I think what we're seeing, and with the proliferation of smartphones, even across people who aren't normal IT consumers, like teenagers at home, security takes a front and center role here in ways that it hadn't before, because the implications of not considering security and that associated spend that drives security is that a single dirty link that someone clicks on, or a single app that's shouldn't be trusted but is and gets installed on a phone, there can be some dramatic consequences there. To overlay that on performance, the user experience is certainly impacted by the multiple layers of security that we should be thinking about in our day-to-day lives. So security is not only an increased spend for consumers and work from home users, but it also impacts user experience and should be something that's considered as you look at those multiple layers and how they work together.
Okay, so thinking outside of security, which I think understandably needs to be a primary consideration, are there any other unconventional areas of tech spend where you think consumers will be stretching their wallets this fall?
I don't know that they'd be unconventional. I think that the work from home devices that we limped along with in the pandemic, we weren't always prepared. We didn't budget for new devices. We kind of took home something that the school offered, or we rummaged around in the attic and had last year's laptop that that we brought and refreshed for the kids to use. So I just think that general refresh cycle is one that's increasing our spend. So I was in an unfortunate position recently where a child had broken a smartphone, and that smartphone was kind of a hand-me-down, and those are expensive to replace. And kids need something that's serviceable, and smartphones, tablets, laptops, I think represent a significant investment in technology, especially if you consider the global component shortage and you don't always have your pick of the best value of device. You have the pick of what can be shipped to you when you need it.
Yeah, outside of the logistical challenge of the supply chain right now, which is I think I can get something in 2 days because I'm used to getting it in 2 days, and that's not possible for some devices right now. I think the refresh angle is a really good one because many dealt with substandard devices for longer than they would have, thinking that the pandemic was going to be a little bit shorter than it has turned out to be. And I think as we've kind of progressed, that's very clear that people are looking to upgrade, people are looking to really overhaul their connection, be it schooling or at work or even back in the office. So I think it's an interesting trend we're seeing now.
So you're saying that 6-year-old Chromebook with 802.11n doesn't cut it anymore?
Potentially not. And that's another thing. You upgrade the devices, do you have to upgrade the access point, right? Depending on what you have in your house, you may have to do a whole refresh.
Yeah, I think we could probably do a whole episode on in-home connectivity refresh.
Perhaps we will.
Yeah, great idea, Adam. Yeah, because nothing's changed over the past 6 years. You can totally just still use the same software and hardware without consequences. Totally the case. Yeah, and I think you raise a good point, like you were saying, about pulling out that old Dell or something that might have been sitting in a closet for a while.
Everyone cares about zero trust, or we hear about it a lot, but you have to be really careful and thoughtful about when you move from trust to zero trust model that doesn't disrupt normal business process. Because if you're not careful, and as we've seen, zero trust can mean zero connectivity.
Okay, so during the pandemic, work from home and learn from home, a phrase that I think we just invented here, we're often at odds with each other in the battle for network resources. What were some of the biggest challenges at the height of the pandemic, and what are some maybe pitfalls we should avoid as we look towards more long-term solutions for both working and learning remotely?
I'd say it starts with the user experience, but it most often involves local infrastructure, in-home Wi-Fi, how the users are connecting, what the performance of the last mile ISP or even online or offline status of that service. So when I talk about user experience, it's can I get online? Is the app slow or not? That's the cry for help that I often heard in the last 18 months when I'm on a meeting upstairs in the office and I have a cry from a learner or a spouse who's also working remotely. The first thing I hear is such and such an app is slow or I can't connect. What do you do? So I see smiles here. I think you've all probably gotten the calls from a friend or a roommate or family member and being asked to step in and help. So I'd say overstressed home networks, wired or wireless symptoms, local connectivity, endpoint challenges, and really the need to up-level and better support these last 50 feet users.
Yeah, during the pandemic, I feel like users have gotten smarter or gotten a large education on how it all works. Because before the pandemic, you couldn't explain to many people I work with, like, what the different components are. And now they at least have some exposure to that as they've had to kind of deal with them themselves, right? You take for granted that the internet or network works in the office because you're given a laptop. It is connected to a work group or connected to a specific location. It has maybe a static IP in the office, right? Everything is already set up for you. And I think what we've learned, or one of the biggest challenges for the user side, has been trying to understand some of that IT world. And so hopefully they've gained an appreciation of how complicated it is. I kind of doubt that. They probably still just complain the app is slow. But at the same time, it has been an interesting time to educate not only the end user, but also help IT kind of spread the doctrine.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I know that a lot of IT organizations probably felt like they were being stretched thin because they were dealing with issues that didn't necessarily pertain to their knowledge workers who were logging on from home, but larger issues at that last 50 feet, like you had said, Adam. What are some tips for IT? I mean, I guess in managing that new reality, I mean, should they set new expectations for what's in and out of their control? Or should they really just be considering each remote location where their workers are logging on fully in their purview, or somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think the outcome of a remote worker or learner not being able to get to that app with a quality user experience will have negative consequences, regardless of whose responsibility it is. But I think the only resource, whether it's a school or a business, is the IT person who's responsible for assuring that the app is up and assuring that the user has the right environment. So I think this does mean that IT has to kind of stretch their bubble of responsibility and do at least best effort to help the customers understand that the issue that you're having, we've got to point the finger at Xfinity. You need to call Comcast, but the end user won't have that insight unless they have a trusted advisor somewhere. How do you draw the line? How do you know that the problem is not with the VPN or with the corporate or the application? Someone has to make that segmentation determination. Now, the outcome of that might be, this is your problem, go call Comcast. And then the user goes and does that. But the user won't really know that because they don't have the skills or insight or tools required to do so.
My advice is policy as education. Tell people they have to be wired so that they understand that wireless doesn't always work as well as wired, right? When you have people wired, they're going to have a better experience by and large. They may still have problems for such and such a reason. Maybe it's the ISP, maybe it's something else. But I think at this point, we have a number of customers that are enacting wired-only policies at home. And that has helped save some headaches because they don't have to involve a wireless engineer and a network technician and maybe a UCAS technician in their own business to all solve one person's problem. So you get that 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 troubleshooting ratio, which is just a killer for IT efficiency. And I think the other one is that there's a lot of things you can learn about your local network by being forced to be wired. I mean, Adam here is the one who introduced me to Powerline Ethernet and trying some other solution that allows me to wire instead of having to be on wireless all day, because we've all found that over the past 18 months, being on a Zoom all day on wireless, you're going to have problems. It doesn't matter who your ISP is.
Right on the money there, Alec. Even if your infrastructure is perfect, you're on a wired connection and you have fiber to the home with a symmetric gig link, and you have no packet loss, there will be issues with your video conferencing, your collaboration provider at some point. I mean, we subscribe to Zoom today, love the service, and I see the alerts. They come through, and there are alerts. So depending on what region you're in, you're always going to see some variability there. But I think, to your point, Alec, is if you can segment the issue, rule out a wireless or RF issue by saying, okay, users, thou shall always have a wired connection. Let's start there. And then we'll start from that strong foundation. Just like when we do this podcast, thou shall have a wired headset. Let's rule out Bluetooth and DECT, and let's rule out RF and in-home Wi-Fi. If you can start there, you can cut the animal in half. That is the problem.
All right. So if schools that have planned for in-person this fall go back to full remote, what are some tips for parents to future-proof their home today, aside from obviously keeping a better eye on security? What else can we do as some table stakes?
Well, I think to carry on the last mile connectivity, how to rule in and rule out issues, I think start with ensuring that your remote learners and workers have a wired connection wherever they are in the house. As we talked about with wired connectivity, make sure that your remote workers and remote learners have access to wired Ethernet wherever they are in the house. Now, recognizing that not everyone here is in the middle of a home reno where you can put Cat5 everywhere, you might need to fall back to the next best thing, which is very strong in-home Wi-Fi. So think about the combination of, as Alec mentioned, broadband or wireline Ethernet in your in-home wiring. How do you light up your in-home infrastructure to extend wired connectivity? How do you do a good mesh network with range extenders that have a wired backhaul? So those are some of the things I think about. Just make sure that your router is up to date. You're not on 802.11b or N. You're probably using AC, or maybe thinking about Wi-Fi 6 if your clients and access points can support that. So how do you give yourself the best odds of valid in-home performance?
$1 million question. What do you think the norm's going to be going forward? Do we think it's a hybrid work, 2 days in the office, 3 days at home future across the board? Do you think that it's too early to really stake a claim like this? I know we have our own policies at AppNeta, but what do you think across the enterprise customer base is going to be the case going forward?
I think what we're seeing in the news is probably consistent with how I'd answer. You're seeing some very large companies with workers who are empowered to work remotely will continue to do so. And the return to office is probably going to be delayed slightly. And when I say slightly, it's probably in the order of weeks or months, potentially early 2022 from what we're seeing with companies like Amazon announcing return to office in 22. But I think you'll have, let's assume that everyone who will go back to the office does so whenever that is, there will be a larger population of remote workers at home and then transiting to and from the office to be hybrid. So you'll have the situation where it's not just your 10 or 15% of workers who are at home on a VPN connection. Hybrid work means remote workers at scale in ways that it never did before. And I think this may be a technology problem, but I think more likely it'll be a culture and a workflow problem where you now have to embrace the hybrid culture. You have users in conference rooms working alongside users who are remote at scale that wasn't the case a year or two ago. So I think that's something we'll need to consider. Again, probably more culture than tech challenges, but looking forward to that. Actually, just looking forward to the ability to exercise that problem and be back in the office alongside you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of large enterprises were targeting September, but you haven't heard a lot of the mechanisms in place that would start that process in the next month. So I think you're right. I think we're going to see a delay, and it'll be interesting. I think the idea that a user could be at home one day and in the office the next, while in theory seems fairly easy, actually compounds the problem of network troubleshooting, network visibility into where are they, what connection are they over, and not only kind of labeling and keeping your mental map for that, but also understanding what their connection is like. So when they complain, do you even know where they are that day? And so understanding that is going to be one of those base level pieces of data that is going to have to be brought into the fold in order to actually help these users.
Yeah, so we got to take a user-based approach to network visibility, plain and simple. Whether it's work from home, whether it's work from anywhere, whether you're back in office, it's all about that individual user going forward. Now, dare I ask our predictions for back to school, or even our wishes or pie in the sky hopes for the future?
I know locally here in New Hampshire, one of my family members is on the local school board, and it's very clear that there is the intent and the need for students' well-being to be back in school full time. So we're not hearing about remote learning being a possibility. So there are options for those families who need to have that be the case. But for the most part, our steady state will be return to school full time.
You know what the scariest thing is for those of us in the Northeast? What happens to snow days if you can do remote learning?
Heartbreaking, seriously. All right, guys. Well, thanks again, Adam and Alec, and thank you, listeners, for joining us on Stories from the Wire, the AppNeta podcast. Subscribe to our feed to get the latest tips and tricks every week on how to manage network performance for the future of work.